The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen counter for 3 days before I finally opened it. I kept walking past it, once in the morning when I was rushing to brew coffee before the rest of the house stirred, and once at night when my feet ached so badly that each step from the laundry room to my small bedroom felt like crossing a desert. I told myself it was nothing, probably a formal notice about the new household schedule, or another reminder about the dress code during private events. Mr. Youngji's estate ran on rules the way a clock runs on gears, precise, impersonal, endless. But something about the cream-colored envelope, stamped with no return address, made me hesitant. It had my name on it, not the maid or household staff, Ava. Just Ava, written in clean, deliberate strokes that didn't match the printed letterheads I was used to receiving from the estate's administrative office. I opened it on a Tuesday morning, alone in the kitchen, while the espresso machine hissed and the gray Chicago dawn pressed flat against the tall windows. Inside was a single black credit card. No note, no explanation. Just the card, slick and cold against my fingertips, with my full name embossed along the bottom in silver lettering, Ava Moreau. I turned it over twice, placed it on the counter, picked it up again. My reflection stared back at me from the dark surface. A woman who hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night in 3 weeks, hair pulled back tight, uniform already pressed and pristine, because appearing unraveled in this house was not something I allowed myself. I was 26 years old, and I looked, in that moment, like someone who had learned very early that the world does not pause for exhaustion. I didn't know what the card meant. I didn't know its limit, its purpose, or why it existed. What I knew was that 3 other women in this household had received identical envelopes that same week. I'd seen them whispering near the East Wing corridor, cards fanned between their fingers like playing cards. Already planning. Camille had laughed, that sharp, practiced laugh she used when she wanted everyone to know she wasn't impressed even when she was. Raina had immediately pulled out her phone. Jisoo had simply smiled and said nothing, which somehow felt the most dangerous of all. None of them had spoken to me about it directly. They rarely did. I was the maid, not a personal assistant, not a private chef, not a social secretary. I cleaned. I organized. I made sure the 14-room penthouse on the 42nd floor of one of Chicago's most private residential towers remained exactly as immaculate as its owner required. I polished surfaces that no one touched. I ironed sheets that were changed whether or not they'd been slept in. I existed in the spaces between the glamour of this place, invisible by design, necessary by function. The other 3 women existed differently. Camille managed Mr. Youngjae's social calendar and attended certain events at his side, her French accent sharpened to a weapon she deployed carefully. Raina handled correspondence and travel logistics, beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, maintained, strategic, aware of her own value. Jisoo had a title nobody fully explained to me. She simply appeared wherever she was needed, fluid and watchful. I was none of those things. I was the woman who found the forgotten coffee cups, and knew which shelf the spare towels lived on, and never, under any circumstances, made noise. And yet my name was on that card. I slipped it into the pocket of my apron and went back to work. I had been employed at the Park Estate for 8 months by then, and in that time I had constructed a careful, detailed map of what I was and was not supposed to notice. I was not supposed to notice the black SUVs that rotated in 3-hour intervals outside the building, engines always running. I was not supposed to register the men who materialized in doorways whenever Mr. Youngjae moved through the apartment, broad-shouldered and quiet, communicating in glances rather than words. I was not supposed to find it unusual that certain rooms required a key I didn't have, that certain phone calls caused the entire household to fall suddenly, carefully silent, or that deliveries sometimes arrived at 3 in the morning and were gone by dawn. The agency that placed me here had been thorough in its orientation. You will maintain absolute discretion. You will not discuss the household with outside parties. You will not photograph, record, or retain any documents you encounter during your duties. You will sign here, and initial here. I had signed everything without hesitation because I needed the income, and because the salary was 3 times what I'd earned anywhere else, and because my mother's physical therapy bills had been accumulating for 2 years with the quiet persistence of water damage, invisible until suddenly catastrophic. So I kept my head down. I did my work. I learned the rhythms of the house and moved within them like something native to the current, unnoticed, untroubling. Until the morning I actually encountered him. Not for the first time, of course. I had been in the same room as young Jay Park on perhaps a dozen occasions over 8 months. But those moments had the quality of passing a painting in a museum. You register it, you feel its weight, and then you move on because you understand it belongs to a different world than yours. That Tuesday morning, I was on my knees in the main corridor, replacing the baseboards I'd been re-cleaning because a guest the night before had scuffed them, when I heard the elevator open. I didn't look up. That was rule number 1, self-imposed. Do not make eye contact when he's in motion. Not because anyone had told me to, but because I'd understood instinctively that drawing his attention was a door best left closed. I heard him stop. The silence that followed had texture. It pressed against the back of my neck like a hand not quite touching. I kept my eyes on the baseboard. My cloth moved in slow, even circles. You're still here. His voice was low. Not questioning, exactly. Observing. I sat back on my heels and looked up, because ignoring a direct address would have been worse than the eye contact. He was standing perhaps 6 feet away in a charcoal suit that fit him the way shadows fit dark rooms, like it had been made for exactly this purpose. The collar of his white shirt was open at the throat, and the tattoos that covered his neck caught the corridor light in shifting patterns, dark ink against skin, intricate and deliberate. He was younger looking than the weight of his presence suggested. Early 30s, maybe, with a face that had the particular stillness of someone who had learned to keep everything important behind the surface. He was looking at me the way I sometimes imagined museum curators looked at things they couldn't yet classify. "Yes, sir," I said. "I apologize for the disruption. I'll be finished shortly." He didn't respond to that. His gaze dropped briefly to the baseboard, then returned to me. "Do you always work this early?" "I prefer mornings," I said carefully. "It's quieter." Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible, the way the surface of still water shifts when something moves underneath it. Then one of his men appeared at the far end of the corridor, and Youngji's attention transferred there without a word, without a gesture. He walked away in that direction, unhurried, and the air in the corridor seemed to repressurize slowly in his absence. My hands, I noticed, had gone very still. I thought about the card all day. By evening, I had made a decision that I told myself was practical and nothing more. I would use it for what I actually needed. Not because I was testing anything, not because I wanted to impress or perform, but because my mother had an appointment on Friday, and the copay had climbed again, and the number in my checking account had a way of looking smaller every time I checked it. I used the card once, online, a single transaction. The total was $43.17, 3 months' worth of the specific joint supplement her doctor had recommended, purchased from the pharmacy's website, because the in-store price was higher. $43.17 on a card with no visible limit, in a household where the weekly floral arrangements cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I didn't think about it again that night. I made dinner for the staff, cleaned the kitchen, folded the last of the linens, and went to my small room at the end of the service corridor. I was almost asleep when my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, 3 words. "Come see me." I stared at the screen for a long moment, the blue light harsh in the darkness of my room. There was no name attached, no explanation. But I knew, with a certainty that settled in my chest like cold water, exactly who had sent it. And I knew, somehow, already, that whatever came next had nothing to do with $43.17. It had been watching me long before the card. I stood outside his study door for longer than I should have. The corridor on the 39th floor, 3 floors below the main residence, where Mr. Youngjay kept his private office, was different from the rest of the building. No art on the walls, no ambient lighting designed to feel welcoming. Just clean, dark paneling, and a silence so complete it had its own sound, a low, almost electrical hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. 2 men stood on either side of the door, and they didn't look at me when I approached, which somehow felt worse than if they had. I knocked twice. Soft, deliberate. "Come in." The study was large and dim, lit by a single lamp on the desk and the residual glow of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago spread below like a circuit board, thousands of lights pulsing against the dark. He was seated behind the desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The tattoos that began at his neck continued down both forearms in dense, interlocking patterns that I'd never been close enough to examine until now. 3 phones were arranged to his left, a glass of water, untouched, to his right. He didn't look up immediately. He finished reading whatever was in front of him, set it face down, and then looked at me with that same measuring quality I'd felt in the corridor that morning, as though I were a variable he was still calculating. "Sit down, Ava." My name in his mouth landed differently than I expected. Not cold, not commanding, careful. Like something being placed precisely on a surface. I sat in the chair across from his desk and kept my hands flat on my knees. "You used the card," he said. It wasn't an accusation. His tone was entirely neutral, which was more unsettling than anger would have been. "Yes," I said. "Once. Yes." A pause. He leaned back in his chair and studied me with an expression I couldn't read. Not displeasure, not approval. Something more patient than either. "The others have been busy," he said. "Camille spent $11,000 at a boutique on Michigan Avenue this afternoon. Raina booked a suite at a hotel in Miami for next weekend. Jisoo made a single transfer to a brokerage account." He paused. "And you spent $43 on vitamins." The word vitamins in his voice, delivered without inflection, made the back of my neck warm. "Joint supplements," I said, because precision felt safer than silence. "For my mother. She has arthritis in both knees." He didn't respond to that immediately. His gaze remained on me, and I had the unsettling sensation of being read, not my words, but the space around them. The things I hadn't said. "Why didn't you spend more?" he asked. "Because I didn't need more." That wasn't the question. I looked at him directly then, which I hadn't fully allowed myself to do since sitting down. Up close, the stillness of his face was even more pronounced. Every feature composed, nothing accidentally revealed. But his eyes were darker than I'd expected, and they held a focus so complete, it made the rest of the room feel slightly out of frame. "I don't spend money I haven't earned," I said. Something changed in his expression. Not much. A fractional shift, like a door opening 1 inch into a room full of light. "That will be all," he said quietly. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the door. "Ava," I stopped with my hand not quite on the handle. "Your mother's next appointment. When is it?" The question was so unexpected that for a moment I simply stood there, processing the fact that he had known there was a next appointment at all. "Friday," I said. He nodded once, eyes already returning to the papers on his desk. I left before I could think too carefully about what had just happened. Wednesday arrived with rain. I moved through the apartment in the particular rhythm that bad weather created, The windows needed attention. The rugs near the entrance tracked moisture. The kitchen skylight developed a condensation pattern that had to be managed before it reached the cabinets below. I worked steadily and tried not to think about the study, about the lamplit room and his voice saying $43, as though the smallness of the number had told him something significant. Around mid-morning, Camille found me in the east hallway. She was dressed in a silk blouse the color of cream, hair pinned back with the effortless precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting the appearance of not trying. She stopped when she saw me and tilted her head slightly, the way a bird does when it's deciding whether something is food or obstacle. "He called you in last night," she said. Not a question. "He calls many people in," I replied, and went back to the window. She was quiet for a moment. A deliberate quiet, weighted with the specific calculation of a woman accustomed to measuring what others reveal in unguarded moments. "Be careful, Ava." Her voice dropped, the French lilt smoothing into something flatter and more serious. "Men like him don't notice people like us without a reason, and the reason is never simple." I kept my eyes on the glass and said nothing. She left. The rain continued. I told myself her warning meant nothing, that she was territorial, competitive, reading motives into a 5-minute administrative meeting because she'd spent $11,000 and been summoned to the study too, probably, and found the result unsatisfying. I told myself that, and I almost believed it. Thursday brought something I hadn't anticipated. At 7 a.m, a woman I'd never seen before arrived at the service entrance, middle-aged, carrying a medical bag, introduced to me by one of the household staff simply as Dr. Shin. She smiled at me with the professional warmth of someone accustomed to unusual appointments. "I'm here for the home visit," she said. "I'm sorry?" "For your mother, dear. The address was arranged. We'll be going to her this morning. Are you ready?" I stood in the service doorway for what felt like a very long time. The black SUV that arrived 10 minutes later had heated seats and a driver who didn't speak, and Dr. Shin spent the 40-minute ride reviewing notes on a tablet with the focused calm of someone entirely comfortable with the irregularity of her morning. My mother's apartment was on the south side. A third-floor walk-up that always smelled faintly of the lavender soap she'd used my entire life. She opened the door in her robe, startled to see me on a Thursday, more startled to see the doctor. "Ava, what on earth—" "It's all right, Mama," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Dr. Shin was thorough, gentle, and clearly excellent. She spent an hour with my mother, reviewed her history, recommended adjustments to her current treatment plan, and left a printed referral for a specialist whose office was within walking distance of my mother's building. She also left quietly a small bag of samples and a printed schedule. In the elevator going down, I turned to her. "Who arranged this?" I asked, though I already knew. She smiled again, that professionally warm smile. "I was simply given an address and a time, Ms. Moreau. I don't ask more than that." The SUV took me back to the tower. I sat in the back seat with my hands in my lap, and the city moving past the tinted windows and something tight and burning behind my sternum that I refused to name. He had done this quietly, without telling me, without making it a transaction or a demonstration. It had simply been arranged, the way certain powerful men arrange things, without ceremony or expectation of acknowledgement, which somehow made it harder to dismiss than a grand gesture would have been. I was still untangling the feeling when I walked back into the apartment. Jisoo was waiting near the service entrance, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and an expression of quiet, precise attention. "He's having people over tonight," she said, without preamble. "Private dinner, 12 guests. He wants the apartment at full staff." "Of course," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. "Stay visible tonight, Ava. Don't disappear into the back rooms the way you usually do." She paused. Those were his words, not mine. She walked away before I could respond. "Stay visible." I stood in the service corridor and felt the walls of the apartment contract slightly around me. Gilded, impeccable, Impossibly quiet walls that I had cleaned and maintained for 8 months, without fully understanding that they had been, perhaps, watching me back the entire time. The dinner was at 8. By 7:45, the guests had begun arriving, and the apartment filled with the sound of expensive shoes on marble and low conversations conducted in the register of people who have nothing to prove. I moved between the dining room and the kitchen with controlled efficiency, refilling water glasses, managing the rhythm of the courses, staying close enough to the room to be useful. He was at the head of the table. I felt his presence the way you feel a change in pressure, not dramatically, but in the body, in the way the air sits differently. At some point during the third course, I reached across to remove a side plate, and I was close enough to catch the faintest trace of his cologne, cedar and something darker beneath it, smoke or leather, or the particular scent of rooms where serious decisions are made. I straightened, turned to move back toward the kitchen, and found his eyes already on me, not searching, not moving, simply there, steady and dark across the candlelit table, with the quality of something that had been in place for much longer than the moment I'd noticed it. One of his guests said something. He turned to respond, smooth and immediate, the perfect host. But my hands, gripping the side plate, had gone slightly cold, and across the table, almost invisible against the white linen, I noticed Camille watching me with an expression that made the cold spread further. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. The morning after the dinner, I found a key on my pillow. Not a card key, not a coded fob, an actual key, brass and old-fashioned. The kind that belonged to something that had been locked for a long time. There was no note, no envelope with my name in careful strokes. Just the key, placed with deliberate precision on the white pillow of my narrow bed in the service corridor room, which meant someone had entered while I slept. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time, the key warm in my palm, and tried to decide whether I was frightened or something more complicated than frightened. I went to work. The key stayed in my apron pocket all morning, pressing against my hip like a question I hadn't agreed to answer. By mid-afternoon, I had identified what had opened. There was a door at the far end of the 38th floor, below the private office, above the building's secure parking, that I had walked past every day for 8 months without registering as significant. It had the quality of things designed not to be noticed. Same paneling as the walls around it. No visible handle from a distance, set slightly recessed into the frame. I had assumed it was a utility access point, the kind of door that belongs to building systems rather than people. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a library. Not a decorative one. Not the curated architectural kind that wealthy people maintain for appearances, with matching spines arranged by color and books that have never been opened. This was a room that had been used. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, packed without aesthetic concern, organized in a system that made sense only to whoever had built it. A reading chair near the window, its leather worn soft at the armrests, a low table with a lamp. The smell of the room hit me first. Paper and cedar and something faintly like rain, the particular smell of a space that has held the same air for years. On the reading chair, placed with the same deliberate precision as the key on my pillow, was a book. I crossed the room and picked it up. A collection of Korean poetry, translated into English, the spine creased from repeated opening. A single page was marked with a strip of paper. Not a bookmark, just a torn edge, casual and unself-conscious. The marked poem was short. I read it twice, standing in the amber light of the library, and felt something move through me that I didn't entirely understand. It was about a bird that had forgotten it could fly because it had lived in a warm room for so long. I set the book down carefully, sat in the reading chair, looked at the city through the window, which faced a different direction than any window I'd stood at before in this building, north, toward the lake, which was the color of pewter in the afternoon light. I didn't hear him come in. He moved without sound when he chose to, which I had learned was a deliberate skill rather than an accident. "You found it," he said. I didn't startle. I had stopped startling around him, which itself felt significant. "You left a key on my pillow," I said, "while I was sleeping." "Yes, that's not appropriate." A pause. Then, with absolute composure, "No, it isn't." I turned to look at him. He was standing near the door, jacket on this time, one hand in his pocket. The afternoon light reached him differently in this room. Less severe than the study, less theatrical than the dining room. He looked in this light almost young, almost like someone who had started out as something other than what he'd become. "Why?" I asked. He considered the question seriously, which I hadn't expected. "Because you've been in this apartment for 8 months, he said. "And you've never once taken anything for yourself. Not a spare hour, not a quiet room, not even a reasonable amount of sleep, based on the lights in the service corridor." He paused. "I wanted to give you somewhere to be that wasn't about function." The simplicity of the answer was more disarming than anything elaborate would have been. I looked back at the window. "The poem," I said. "My mother used to read it to me." A beat of silence. She thought I needed reminding. I didn't ask what he needed reminding of. The room held the question gently, and neither of us reached for it. 3 days passed in a different quality of tension. He didn't summon me again, didn't acknowledge me differently in the presence of the household. But things shifted in ways that were invisible to cataloging yet impossible to ignore. A better lamp appeared in my room without explanation. The schedule was quietly adjusted so that my heaviest work was front-loaded in the mornings, leaving evenings lighter. The library key remained mine. Camille noticed. She didn't say anything directly. She was too skilled for directness when indirection served better. But I felt her attention tracking me through rooms, measuring the distance between where I stood and where he stood, calculating. Raina had retreated into a careful blankness that told me she'd drawn her own conclusions. Jisoo remained impossible to read, which I had come to understand was itself a form of communication. On the 4th morning, Camille appeared in the kitchen while I was alone. She poured herself coffee with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had decided the conversation would happen on her timeline. "He's never shown anyone that library," she said. I kept my hands busy at the counter. "I wouldn't know about that." "I've been here 2 years, Ava." Her voice was even, stripped of its usual social gloss. "I have never seen that door open. I didn't know what was behind it." She set her cup down. "You've been here 8 months, and you have a key. I think you should speak to him if you have concerns," I said carefully. "I'm speaking to you." The evenness cracked, just slightly. Not into anger, but into something rawer. "Because you seem like someone who doesn't understand what she's walked into. And I'm deciding whether that's genuine or very, very well performed." I turned to face her then. "I'm the maid, Camille," I said quietly. "I clean rooms. I don't have a strategy." She looked at me for a long moment, searching, measuring, finding something in my face that made her expression shift from calculation toward something more complicated. "That," she said finally, "might be exactly the problem." She took her coffee and left. The evening it broke open arrived without warning, the way significant moments tend to. I was in the library. I had begun going there in the early evenings, sitting in the worn leather chair with whatever book I'd pulled from the shelves, letting the quiet of the room settle over the exhaustion of the day like a blanket. I had not seen young Jay there again since that first afternoon. The space felt both his and not his, offered, not shared. I was reading when the door opened. He stopped when he saw me, and I saw something cross his face that he didn't quite manage to suppress, a brief, unguarded thing, there and gone in less than a second, like light through a closing door. "I can leave," I said immediately, moving to stand. Stay." The word came out faster than I think he intended. I stayed. He came into the room and sat in the chair near the low table. Not close, not distant, the deliberate middle distance of someone navigating an unfamiliar protocol. He had a glass of whiskey. He set it on the table and looked at the window. "There's a situation," he said after a while, "that I need to address tomorrow, involving someone who believed I wouldn't notice what he'd taken from me." He wasn't looking at me. His voice was level, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it. A controlled burn, embers held carefully in check. "I'm telling you," he continued, "because tomorrow may be unusual. The household should stay in their rooms from 7 until I signal otherwise." "I understand," I said. He picked up the whiskey, set it down without drinking. "My father built this organization on one principle," he said quietly. "Loyalty is the only currency that doesn't devalue." He was quiet for a moment. The man I'm dealing with tomorrow was someone I trusted. Completely. I didn't fill the silence. I had learned that silence with him was not something to be managed. It was part of the language. "Does it ever get easier?" I asked. "The betrayal part." He turned to look at me then, and the quality of his gaze in the lamplight was different from anything I'd encountered before. Open in a way that seemed almost involuntary, as though the question had found a seam in the careful architecture of his composure. "No," he said, simply and completely. We sat in the library while the city glowed beyond the window, and the silence between us became, without either of us acknowledging it, something other than empty. When I finally rose to leave, he didn't move. But as I reached the door, his voice followed me, low and unhurried. "You're the only person in this apartment," he said, "who has never asked me for anything." I paused at the threshold. "That's because I work for you," I said. "No." There was something quiet and absolute in the word. "That's not why." I left the library and walked back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed and pressed my hands flat against my knees to stop them from trembling. Not from fear, but from the particular vertigo of understanding that the ground beneath your feet has been shifting for much longer than you realized, and the shift is now too far along to step back from. The key was still in my apron pocket. I held it in my fist until the trembling stopped. Outside, Chicago exhaled its nighttime breath against the windows of the 42nd floor, and somewhere below me, in rooms I would never see, men were preparing for a morning that had already been decided. And I lay awake until almost 3, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a poem about a bird that had forgotten it could fly, and wondering, for the first time, which one of us it had been written for. I stayed in my room until 9:15. The instruction had been 7 until he signaled otherwise. And the signal came at 8:52, a single knock on my door from one of the household staff, a woman named Petra, who managed the linen inventory and communicated exclusively in functional sentences. "Corridor is clear," she said, and walked away. I had spent the intervening time sitting at the small desk in my room, not reading, not sleeping, simply listening to the quality of the silence in the building around me. It was a different silence than usual, structured, intentional, the kind that gets arranged rather than simply existing. Doors had opened and closed below. At some point, briefly, there had been voices, though not loud enough to distinguish. Then nothing. When I finally came out, the apartment looked exactly as it always did. Immaculate, composed, giving nothing away. Whatever had happened on the floors below had left no mark on the surfaces I maintained. But young Jay was at the kitchen counter when I entered. Not seated, not eating, just standing with both hands braced against the marble and his head slightly bowed, like someone at the end of something long and draining. His jacket was gone. The white shirt was perfect, which told me he'd changed it. His eyes, when he lifted them, were the eyes of a man who had done what was necessary and was now on the other side of it, recalibrating. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. "Are you all right?" I asked. The question seemed to reach him from an unexpected angle. He straightened slowly. "Yes," he said. Then, with the particular honesty of someone too tired to perform, "I will be." I moved to the coffee machine without asking. Made 2 cups the way I'd observed he preferred his. Strong, no sugar, a temperature slightly below scalding so it could be drunk immediately rather than waited on. I set one on the counter near his hand and took mine to the far end of the kitchen. He looked at the cup for a moment. Then he picked it up. We stood on opposite ends of the kitchen in the late morning light and drank coffee without speaking. And it was, inexplicably, given everything, one of the most natural moments I had experienced in 8 months in that apartment. What followed was a week of strange, careful recalibration. The household settled around a new configuration. Camille's presence diminished. Not dramatically, not with the noise of confrontation, but in the steady, conclusive way of a tide going out. I learned from Petra, who learned from someone else, that Camille had submitted her resignation. She had done it formally, professionally, with 2 weeks' notice, and she had moved through those 2 weeks like a woman who had made a decision and intended to honor the shape of it without drama. On her last day, she stopped me in the east hallway, the same place she had warned me weeks before. "You're not what I thought you were," she said. There was no resentment in it, just the flat acknowledgement of a revised conclusion. "I'm still the maid," I said. She almost smiled. "No, Ava, you're not." She picked up her bag. "Take care of yourself. That's the only real advice I have." She left, and the apartment rearranged itself around the space she vacated, the way water rearranges around a removed stone. Raina followed within the month, transferred to another operation in another city, at what I understood was her own request. Jisoo remained. She was, I had come to understand, not simply an employee, but part of a deeper architecture that wouldn't be so easily relocated. She watched the shifting household with the calm of someone who had seen configurations come and go and understood that the structure beneath remained constant. And I remained, cleaning, organizing, going to the library in the evenings. He came more often now. Not always. Sometimes a week passed without him appearing in the doorway. But when he did, it was without preamble or announcement, as natural as if the library had always been shared rather than lent. He read. I read. Occasionally we spoke, and those conversations had a quality I couldn't map onto anything else in my life. Unguarded in a way that seemed to cost him something, each exchange a small door opened in a wall that was otherwise continuous. I learned that his father had died when Youngjae was 19, passing down an organization built across 3 decades with the quiet expectation that the weight of it would simply transfer, as weight does, to the next available surface. I learned that he had one sister, living in Seoul, who believed he worked in private finance and called him every Sunday morning. I learned that the library had belonged to his father, shipped piece by piece from Korea, and that the worn leather chair had been his father's reading chair, and that he sat in the other one by the table not because of any explicit rule, but because he simply always had. I told him in return smaller things, about my mother's hands before the arthritis, how they had moved when she was cooking, how the kitchen of my childhood had smelled on Sunday mornings, about the scholarship I had deferred 3 years ago and still thought about in the quiet hours, about the feeling of being invisible in rooms, and how it had become so habitual that I'd stopped registering it as a loss. He listened the way very few people listen, completely, without preparing his response while I was still speaking, without making the conversation a tennis match of equal disclosures. He simply took in what I said, and held it with a care that was more unsettling than any intensity I could have anticipated. One evening he said, without looking up from his book, The scholarship. What was it for? Architecture, I said. He turned a page. You notice how spaces feel, he said. I've watched you in rooms. You register them differently than other people do. I hadn't known he'd been watching me in rooms. The thought sent something warm and slightly alarming through my chest. It was a long time ago, I said. 3 years isn't long. I didn't answer that. He didn't press. But 3 days later, a brochure appeared on the reading table in the library. A continuing education program at the architecture school downtown. Evening courses, beginning in January. No note. No instruction. Just the brochure, placed with the same deliberate quietness as the key on my pillow. I picked it up and held it, and felt the walls of my understanding shift again. The possession revealed itself gradually, and then all at once. I had begun, without fully deciding to, altering the geography of my days, spending less time in the invisible margins of the apartment, and more time in the main rooms, visible the way he'd asked me to be at the dinner. It wasn't performance. It was something more honest and more frightening than that. I had simply stopped engineering my own disappearance, which meant that one afternoon, when a man arrived unannounced through channels I didn't understand, someone from a connected operation in New York, broad and loud in the way of men accustomed to taking up space, and found me alone in the sitting room, reading a journal I'd borrowed from the library. I didn't scatter. I looked up. I nodded. I said hello with the measured calm of someone who belonged where she sat. The man looked at me with the particular assessment of someone recalculating a room's contents. "Who are you?" he asked, with the directness of someone who considered social convention optional. "Ava," I said. "And what are you to Young Jay?" I opened my mouth to say I work here, the sentence I'd said 100 times. Automatic and true and completely insufficient. She's mine. Young Jay's voice came from the doorway. Quiet. Absolute. Not loud, not theatrical. The kind of declaration that doesn't require volume because it carries its own gravity. The man from New York recalibrated visibly. Young Jay entered the room, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The air tightened. The dynamics restructured around his presence the way they always did. He placed himself between me and the man without making it look deliberate, which I understood was entirely deliberate. Later, after the man had been taken to the office, after the apartment had resettled, I found Young Jay in the library. "I'm not yours," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. He was standing at the window. He turned to look at me with an expression that had moved past composure into something more direct. "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because he needed to understand something quickly," he said, and that was the most efficient way to communicate it. A pause. "And because—" He stopped, looked at the window, looked back at me. "Because it was true, whether or not I have the right to say it. The honesty of it, raw and unarmored, offered without the careful architecture he maintained around everything else, landed in my chest and stayed there. Young Jay, I said. His name in my mouth felt significant. I had never used it before. What is this? He was quiet for a moment that held its breath. I don't know, he said. But I know I watch every room you leave. And I know I've rearranged things around your presence here that I've never rearranged for anyone. His voice remained low, controlled, but the control was the kind that holds something in, rather than keeping something out. And I know that when Marcus had his hand on your arm at the dinner last month, a man you didn't notice near the door, I had him escorted out before the fourth course. I stared at him. I didn't notice, I said slowly. I know. Something moved through his expression. You never notice the ways I watch you, which makes it considerably harder to stop. The city glowed beyond the window. The library held its cedar and paper silence, and I stood in the middle of it, a woman who had spent the better part of a year making herself invisible, understanding with sudden, complete clarity that I had been, the entire time, the most visible person in the room. "I'm frightened," I told him. Because it was true, and because I had decided, somewhere in the last weeks, that truth was the only currency I had in this place that no one could devalue. "So am I," he said. And that, somehow, was the most frightening thing of all. January came in cold and decisive, the way Chicago winters always do. Not gradually, not with warning, but as a fact presented without negotiation. The lake turned the color of iron. The wind moved through the streets below with the authority of something that has never been asked permission. I enrolled in the architecture program on a Wednesday morning, sitting at the small desk in my room with my laptop and the brochure he had left on the library table, filling out the application with the particular feeling of someone reaching for something they'd left on a high shelf and finding their arms longer than they remembered. When the confirmation email arrived, I sat with it for a long time before closing the laptop and going back to work. I didn't tell him immediately. That evening in the library, I read while he reviewed papers at the low table, and the comfortable silence of the room settled around us, and I let myself have the confirmation as something private for one more night, a small, warm thing belonging only to me before it belonged to the space between us. The following evening, I told him. He looked up from his papers. Something moved through his face. Not surprise, but a quieter, more considered version of satisfaction. The expression of someone who had placed a careful bet on a specific outcome and was watching it arrive. "Good," he said. "Just that." And then he went back to his papers, and I went back to my book, and the simplicity of the moment was more meaningful than any elaborate response would have been. 3 weeks into January, Jisoo came to find me. She appeared in the library doorway on an evening when young Jae was away, meetings in another city. 2 days, the household running in the particular register of a clock whose pendulum has been briefly stilled. She knocked on the open door and waited to be acknowledged, which was itself unusual enough that I set my book down. She came in and sat in the chair by the table, his chair, without apparent self-consciousness, and looked at me with the direct assessing gaze I had never fully learned to decode. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Not as part of this household. As someone who has watched this situation develop from the beginning and has certain information you don't." I waited. "The credit card test," she said. "It wasn't his idea, originally. It was a protocol established by his father, a way of evaluating the people in proximity to the inner household. Loyalty assessment. His father used it 3 times over 30 years. She paused. Young Jae revived it 8 months ago, specifically because of you. The room seemed to rearrange itself slightly around those words. He'd been watching you for 4 months before he gave out the cards, she continued. The way you worked. What you noticed and what you chose not to mention. The fact that you never asked for anything beyond your salary and your privacy. A pause. The cards went to 4 women. He already knew what 3 of them would do. You were the only variable he couldn't calculate. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Jisoo looked at me with an expression that was, for the first time since I'd known her, completely unguarded. "Because you're going to be asked to make a decision soon. And I want you to make it with accurate information, not a partial picture." "What decision?" She rose, smoothed her jacket. "He'll tell you himself. I just wanted you to know that nothing about this was accidental. Not the library key, not the doctor for your mother, not the brochure." She paused at the door. "He doesn't do anything without intention, Ava. The question is whether his intentions are ones you can build a life inside of." She left. The library held its silence. I sat in the worn leather chair until the city outside the window shifted from evening into proper night, turning Jesu's words over the way you turn a stone to see what has been living beneath it. He returned from his meetings on a Friday evening, and I knew the moment he walked into the apartment that something had been decided in his absence. Not resolved exactly, but arrived at. The way long internal calculations eventually produce a number whether you're ready for it or not. He came to the library. He sat in the chair by the table. He looked at me with that direct, undefended quality that had become, over these weeks, the version of him I thought about in the quiet hours. Not the man with 3 phones and men in doorways, but this one, in lamplight, with his father's books on the walls around him. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I know," I said. He looked at me. "What do you know?" "That nothing has been accidental. The cards, the key, the doctor." I held his gaze. "That you've been watching me since before I knew there was anything to watch for." A pause. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt, not deflection. Recognition. "Yes," he said. "Were you going to tell me?" "I'm telling you now." I considered that. The fire in the library grate, lit for the first time since winter arrived, shifted and resettled, sending new light across the walls of books. "What did you see?" I asked. "In those first 4 months. What made you certain enough to arrange all of this?" He was quiet for a moment, that felt like the pause before something structural shifts. "You fixed a broken hinge on the service door 3 days after you arrived," he said, without being asked, without telling anyone, without putting in a maintenance request. "You simply found a screwdriver and fixed it." His voice was level, but the quality of attention in it was absolute. I had been watching this household for 2 years, waiting for someone to notice that hinge. It had been broken for 8 months. A pause. "You noticed it on day 3, and your first instinct was to repair it, not to use it as leverage, not to report it, not to perform helpfulness. You simply fixed a broken thing because it needed fixing. The simplicity of it, that a broken hinge had been the beginning, settled into me with an unexpected weight." "That's not remarkable," I said quietly. "No," he agreed. "In most people it would be ordinary. In this house, in the specific context of who I am and what surrounds me, it was the rarest thing I had seen in years." He paused. "Ava, I have spent my entire adult life in rooms full of people calculating their proximity to power. Every gesture weighed, every kindness conditional, every loyalty priced." His voice remained steady, but something beneath it had moved into a register I hadn't heard before, stripped of all performance, direct as the cold outside the windows. "You are the first person in this apartment who has never tried to use me for anything, and I have handled that fact badly, because I had no protocol for it." The fire resettled again. The city breathed against the glass. "What are you asking me?" I said. "I'm not asking anything," he said. "I'm offering. There's a difference." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something on the low table between us. A key, but not brass and old-fashioned like the library key. A modern one, matte black, with a building fob attached. "The apartment on the 35th floor has been empty for a year. It has better light than the service corridor. It's yours, with no conditions and no obligation, whether or not anything else changes between us." He paused. "I'm also offering, if you want it, something more difficult. A place in my life that is real and permanent, which means knowing exactly what my life is, and choosing it with that knowledge." The last sentence landed in the room with the full weight of everything it contained. I understood what it meant. Not the romantic architecture of it, but the actual substance. The SUVs and the men in doorways. The rooms I would never have keys to. The phone calls that silenced households. The mornings like the one 3 weeks ago when the building arranged itself around a reckoning I would never fully see. I looked at him across the low table, in the library that smelled like his father's life, in the city that had never once paused for my exhaustion. "I'm not afraid of difficult," I said. "I know." He held my gaze. "I'm asking if you're afraid of this." I thought about the broken hinge on the service door. I thought about $43.17. I thought about a poem about a bird that had forgotten it could fly, and the worn armrests of a chair, and a brochure left on a table without a note, because the gesture was the note. I thought about my mother's hands, and the scholarship, and the 8 months of making myself invisible in rooms where I had, apparently, been visible the entire time. "No," I said. "I'm not afraid of this." Something in his face shifted, quietly, completely, like a room when the right window is finally opened after a long winter. He didn't move toward me. He wasn't a man who rushed toward things. Instead, he reached across the table and placed his hand, palm up, in the space between us. An offering, not a claim. Patient and still and entirely certain. I placed my hand in his. The architecture program ran Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He rearranged the household schedule around it without being asked, and when I came home on those nights, later than usual, smelling of pencil shavings and coffee from the studio, the library light was always on. Sometimes he was there, sometimes he wasn't, but the light was always on. My mother met him in March, on a Sunday afternoon, when the first real warmth of the year had returned to the city, and she had made the journey north for the first time since her treatment had improved. She sat across from him in the apartment's sitting room with the particular composure of a woman who has spent a lifetime reading people accurately, and she asked him 3 careful questions about things that had nothing to do with what she actually wanted to know, and he answered all 3 with the straightforward honesty he reserved for people he had decided to respect. Afterward, when he had stepped out of the room, she took my hand and held it the way she had when I was very small, both of hers around one of mine, warm and unhurried. "He watches the door every time you leave a room," she said quietly. "I know," I said. She squeezed my hand, said nothing else, which was, from my mother, the fullest possible endorsement. There is a thing that happens, I have learned, when you stop engineering your own invisibility. The world doesn't suddenly become simple. The dangerous things don't become safe. The complicated architecture of a life built inside shadows doesn't transform into something clean and uncomplicated simply because love has taken up residence in it. But you stop disappearing. And that, it turns out, changes everything. I still clean, not because I must, but because I am someone who notices broken hinges and fixes them. And that is not a condition of employment. It is simply who I am. I notice what needs attention. I care for the spaces I inhabit. I always have. The difference is that now I inhabit them fully. The library is still our room, mine and his, and the worn leather chair is still his father's, and the poem about the bird is still marked with a strip of torn paper on the same page. But I have added my own marks to this life, slowly and without apology. Architecture drawings on the table some evenings. My mother's photograph on the shelf between 2 volumes of Korean poetry. The particular smell of the coffee I make, which he has told me is better than what the machine produces, though he still uses the machine when I'm not there. Out of what I have come to understand is not preference but habit. He is still dangerous. That is not a thing that changes, and I would not trust it if it did. The men are still in the doorways. The phones are still arranged in 3s on his desk. The SUVs still rotate below in intervals. And sometimes his jaw sets in a particular way, and his eyes go to a place I cannot follow. And I understand that he is carrying something in those moments that belongs to a world I exist alongside but not inside, and I let him carry it, because I am not afraid of the weight of who he is. What I know. What I have come to know. With the certainty of something lived rather than concluded, is this: he has never once tried to make me smaller. In a life built entirely around the careful management of power, He has given me only more of my own. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The city moves below us, and the lake is blue today, properly blue for the first time since winter. And I am sitting in the library with a drafting pencil behind my ear and a textbook open on my knees. And somewhere in the apartment, a door opens, and I hear, without looking up, the specific cadence of his footsteps. Unhurried, deliberate, moving in my direction. I don't move. I don't disappear. I simply wait, and he finds me exactly where I am, and the light through the north-facing window falls across us both without distinction. Warm and even and entirely indifferent to the considerable distance we each traveled to arrive in the same room. Some cages, I have learned, are not cages at all. They are simply the shape of somewhere you finally chose to stay.